Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for week 4, which is the final week of the short course we're running on SharePoint 2013 development. My name again is Brian Farnhill, and this week we're going to be going through a bit about how to create apps for SharePoint 2013 and the new App Store and the framework and how it all comes together as a new way for us to do development with SharePoint 2013. So the things we're going to go over tonight. We're going to have a bit of an introduction to the new App Store and what it is and how it works and some of the things we need to know about it. We're going to have a bit of a talk around code considerations and limitations of what we can do in code around SharePoint 2013 apps and differences between that and doing things on the server side like we've sort of been looking at for the most part of this short course up until now. We're going to go a bit into how we can deploy apps for SharePoint 2013. So how we can manage updates to apps as well and how that process is rolled out. We're going to talk a little bit around web service calls from apps, particularly with client-side code, and some of the things around cross-domain policies that exist and some of the frameworks that SharePoint has in place to help us as developers get around this. We're going to talk about how to brand and integrate our apps into existing deployments. So ways that we can make our apps look the same as the host site that they're deployed into. So that way users can have a consistent look and feel between their original site and our app. We're talking a little bit about the remote development options and using the developer site, which is one of the site templates. And I'm going to touch briefly again on client-side web parts. We did have a look at those in more depth last week, though, so just a brief sort of mention about them again this week. So, introducing the new app framework. So, what exactly is an app when I say the word app? All right, an app is basically similar in theory to what we do with server-side code and WSP packages. But it operates within a very different framework. It can still include lists and workflows and pages and all of these sorts of things. We can surface data from remote websites and remote web applications and show them up inside of SharePoint. The catch is that the way these apps have been developed is that they are heavily focused on the use of HTML and JavaScript to interact with SharePoint and other client-side technologies, but primarily HTML and JavaScript. Now, the beauty of doing things that way is that we end up with a solution that has few to no dependencies on the actual platform itself. So what this means for us is that when SharePoint goes and updates to the next version, so instead of SharePoint 2013, SharePoint whatever vNext is called, and all of those DLLs inside of SharePoint go and get upgraded from version 15 to version 16. All of a sudden, we've got situations with server-side code where we might need to look at potentially recompiling some of our code against the new API and having to rebind and do a whole bunch of other things. Yes, in some cases, things like assembly binding redirection will help us get around that, assuming the same methods and classes are there. But if something changes even slightly, even the signature of a method, then basically we're going to need to go and relook at our code, retest, recompile, make the changes, and push it all out, right? Whereas if we're working with something that's on a HTML and JavaScript based API, it's generally referred to as what's called loosely bound to SharePoint. So yes, we're using SharePoint's API, but because we're using a communication method, so JavaScript to make those HTTP calls, it's not tightly bound to specific versions of the SharePoint library. Now this works the same as other apps on the internet at the moment. So if you look at Facebook or Twitter, for example, if you've ever sat down and had a bit of a play around with creating apps for those, they work in much the same way in that you make calls over with REST and JSON based APIs and data. And basically if Facebook goes and updates their API or Twitter updates their API, your app is not necessarily going to break, but you're not necessarily going to have to recompile it either. As long as those same endpoints exist to give you the same data back, then you don't need to touch your app at all. So it's what's referred to as loosely bound, and SharePoint's adopting this model. So the other new mechanism that comes into play with the new app framework, though, is the App Store, which is a really big win as far as trying to deliver code and get code out there for SharePoint. So think about this in the context of you've got your mobile device these days, and there's app stores there for you to download apps, and you can browse through and search and find things you're looking for. and then just click a button and install it. We now have exactly the same experience for SharePoint in 2013. There's a public app store that we can create apps and publish them to. We can generate revenue through that. We can have users download and install apps through that app store with a very similar experience there of just click the button, assuming I've got the appropriate permissions to do so, and my app gets installed. So no more having to log onto the server and run through a setup process, or no having to rely on search engines to find the products for the websites for products that I'm looking for. I've now got a one-stop shop for all of these things that we can do to extend the functionality of my SharePoint site. So from the point of view of a developer, particularly one who's looking to create, these wide stream third-party solutions, the App Store is going to create a lot of a lot more interesting ways for us to get our code out there to a bigger audience with a lot less effort from us, and provide a nice consistent way to manage things like updates and how we deliver them as well. So the big focus with the apps, though, was around being able to say that we're just going to use standards-based development, which is a bit of a buzzword phrase there, but let me clarify it all. So we're no longer limited to .NET-based development, and this comes back to the point I made earlier around the fact that it's essentially all HTML and JavaScript-based. Right? So as long as you're generating HTML and JavaScript files, could be just flat HTML and JavaScript files, or it could be running something running on a server side as a PHP application, for example, or Cold Fusion, or whatever it is that you want to use to generate that HTML and JavaScript. As long as you're getting that out as the output, it can integrate as tightly into SharePoint as anything written in .NET as far as the apps are concerned. All right, so the language that we're writing in is no longer relevant. So this does wonders for addressing what has traditionally been a big problem with SharePoint development, in that up until now, you have needed to know C# or VB. So one of the .NET languages, you have needed to have a large amount of SharePoint knowledge that was going to get you over the line for how to package and deploy and effectively manage these solutions. What we're getting now is we're getting a model that's much closer to what regular web developers are used to working with when using other websites. So again, I use Facebook and Twitter as examples, but these open standards of doing things with OAuth and OData and REST, these are common across the internet, right? This is not something that's SharePoint specific. So what this means is that it's going to be a lot easier for people who haven't traditionally gone near SharePoint to be able to come and look at it and pick it up and look at creating apps for the platform, needing far less in the way of SharePoint specific knowledge than they've ever needed before. So when we're running the HTML and JavaScript apps here, they can run locally from the SharePoint server, so we can spit your HTML files out for you and provide the same functionality, or we could be running something up in a remote website, like I mentioned before, and have it integrate in. So it all sits inside of those iframes. So when it comes down to the actual client browsing to the site, we end up with a very transparent experience to them. They're not even aware that one page with a few web parts on it might actually be calling out to 3 or 4 different sources on the internet to come back and bring them a complete experience. So why would we build apps? All right, so what's the benefits to doing this? So an app can be its own web application or website, right? So we're no longer tied to doing things within the context of here's something SharePoint specific. I might have a website somewhere out on the internet and an app that accompanies that. So a companion app for SharePoint that integrates there. So users can come to my website for full functionality, but I've got a few HTML and JavaScript files that are sitting on my server there that can integrate into SharePoint as part of an app that people can then use to create that sort of integration. So we're no longer limited to what we can do inside of SharePoint. We really can step outside and do whatever we want. You can use any language you want for the HTML and JavaScript apps, like I mentioned before, right? So again, we come back down to just use what you know. We can easily create tiered applications that work outside of SharePoint to enable things to scale a lot better than we could before. Now, this is a really important point. So up until now, if I've been writing server-side code for SharePoint, and I need to do some very heavy data crunching inside of a SharePoint page, that means that ideally we look at separating it off onto its own server to not interfere with other features of SharePoint. What ends up happening in that scenario is it's another SharePoint server that gets spun up, which means there's another license attached to it, which means the cost of your solution is just jumped up by the cost of a SharePoint license. Whereas now, if I'm looking at running something remotely, say I could be using Windows Azure as my platform for the web and SQL Azure there, I can quite easily scale out the number of servers and the scope of my application to be running on a much larger set of hardware for just my app, while the actual SharePoint components don't actually change at all. So we get the ability to now scale our customizations independently of what's going on inside of SharePoint, which overcomes a lot of hurdles when it comes to the really big sort of performance-wise applications that have been built for SharePoint. I keep saying this, but we can come back to using the best development tools for the job. We don't even need to stay inside of Visual Studio anymore if you can automate the packaging of the app elsewhere, which is entirely possible as well. And client-side or remotely hosted apps, they're no longer a barrier to rich development scenarios. So one of the things that I've harped on about over this course was the sandbox solutions and the limitations of those and things like that, and that they were a barrier for doing really deeply integrated things within inside of SharePoint. The new apps model has addressed a lot of the concerns that were raised when sandbox solutions were put out and people were trying to use them and trying to do things. And Microsoft has taken a lot of that feedback on board and addressed a lot of that through the apps. There is still a lot of things that you can't do through an app. We'll get into that later, but there is significantly more you can do in an app that you weren't previously able to do inside of a sandbox solution. So a couple of questions that have come in. Currently, employers and job agents seem to require strong ASP.NET and C# when looking for a SharePoint developer. Can I see that trend changing with standard-based development in SharePoint 2013? Maybe. I suppose it all sort of depends. It's a bit hard to predict the future. At the moment, yes, definitely ASP.NET and C# skills have been crucial to date as far as doing SharePoint development because we have been focused quite heavily on server-side code. Now, going forward, this may still be the case. We may find ourselves writing ASP.NET MVC web applications, which spit out the HTML and JavaScript, which come down to our applications, and this might be something that employers still want to focus on. People may make the decision to say, well, yes, we're going to stay with the Microsoft stack. We're no longer working inside of SharePoint, all right? We're working inside of our app, but we are still going to stay within the .NET world and do things that way. So I don't see that it's something that's going to go away. I still do believe that having those skills is going to be crucial to getting a role as far as SharePoint stuff is concerned. But there is a chance that it may become less of a thing depending on who you're going to be working for, really. Another question. Can I specify tiered development, i.e. like MVC or different environments? Yeah, so I think I sort of touched on that as I was explaining it. But so as far as trying to create a truly tiered application inside of SharePoint 2010 with server-side code, yes, we could go and write those the write a web service that we could call out to from our application and then have a data layer sitting in behind that. But we still ultimately had to have that front end integrated off into SharePoint and doing things the SharePoint way. Now we can create something that stands alone as a properly tiered application where the front end is no longer dependent on SharePoint, so we remove that binding and can then look at individually scaling out parts of our application. So I might decide to scale up the database layer performance-wise if I've got something that's data heavy but not too heavy on the web front end side of things. Another one that's just showed up is following my answer on C# being a mainstream programming language, would one be at a disadvantage in developing SharePoint applications if he comes from VB.NET background for developing ASP.NET? Interesting you should ask that. So a little bit of background on myself. When I first started doing .NET, I was actually doing VB.NET, and this was in SharePoint 2007. So we were looking at version 2 of the .NET framework, sort of starting to kick around there. So version 2 of VB.NET. Now, at the time, it was there was a bunch of things that just syntactically you couldn't do in VB.NET or were very difficult to do in VB compared to doing them inside of C#. Now, if we look at current versions of both of the frameworks, it's C# and VB, the differences between them has become a significantly smaller list. So, so from a functionality perspective, there are less things that will cause you to want to go to C# rather than VB. That being said, as far as if you go searching around on the internet and looking for answers to specific SharePoint developer problems, 99% of the time, if you find somebody's blog post or things like that, it's going to have C# on it. It is a very common trend amongst SharePoint developers to be using C# instead of VB.NET. More often than not, I've seen, again, referring to the previous question there, in that job people that are looking for to hire people are looking for C# and ASP.NET. So, I mean, while doing VB instead of C# shouldn't inherently be a problem, Again, it's going to depend on who you're trying to get to hire you, and are they a team of developers that are already working with C#, or are you looking to do things yourself with VB.net, or a team that's already using VB.net? So again, the answer is that it really does depend. But more often than not, if you go looking for support through the internet and blogs and other channels like that, you're going to be finding C# as the common predominant programming language that people are using with SharePoint. So moving on from that, is there a future for WSP packages and server-side code? The short answer is yes, there is. And the reason for this is that the APIs that we have for apps are not yet a complete replacement for what you're going to do server-side. And the reality is that they may never be. Now, the JavaScript APIs, they fall under the same rules as all of the other client-side APIs that have existed that we've touched on to date. Now, this means that they can't get to a bunch of the high-level objects in the API, like the SP farm and the SP web application. So depending on what exactly your customization is trying to do, you may find that apps are not suitable and ultimately may never be suitable, because surfacing that level of functionality through the API creates all sorts of security risks for creating surface attack area and that sort of thing. So apps do provide a lot of benefits though. Like that loose binding, the ability to run anywhere, the ability to be independent of SharePoint, the ability to publish to the App Store and have that immediate wider audience. So when I'm talking to customers about doing development with SharePoint 2013, the general theory is that we start under the premise that everything is going to be an app until I can find a reason for it to not be an app. So when I come across some sort of functional requirement that they've got for the solution that says, oh, we can't do that in an app, that's the point that we look at saying, okay, well, let's do server-side code. And even then, what we may do is say, well, let's do just that part of server-side code as a WSP, but focus on having everything else in being an app. All right, so it's definitely the preferred method of going about doing things, but for the time being, at least, yes, so doing server-side code is still a viable solution. Particularly if you've got stuff that was developed for SharePoint 2010 as server-side and you're looking to upgrade to 2013, you may find that it's easier to look at saying, well, let's keep the application server-side for now, get the rest of SharePoint upgraded, and we'll level out and make sure that everything's stable there, and then look at how we can change those apps across from server-side code to client-side apps and doing things that way. So rather than trying to do it all at once and convert everything across, you get that ability to just leave it as server-side code for now. Everything is still there and supported, and the changing in the API on the server side between 2010 and 2013 was fairly minimal. So chances are there's not going to be a whole lot of stuff you're going to need to change going from version to version there. But definitely if you're starting something from scratch with 2013, definitely give a lot of consideration to what's going on the apps side of things there. So when I start talking about being able to run these apps remotely and do things remotely with the apps, the very first question that I get back from most developers is, okay, well, that's well and good, but where exactly am I going to run my app? Where does it live now that it doesn't live inside of SharePoint? There's 3 options for what we can do in here. There's SharePoint hosted, auto hosted, and provider hosted. So SharePoint hosted is exactly what it sounds like. It means that all of the files for your app are going to live inside of SharePoint. This is the model that we used in the ClientSide Web Part demo last week, where basically we create an app and we deploy it to SharePoint, and it consists of nothing more than HTML or ASPX pages that are only using out-of-the-box controls, JavaScript, CSS, and that's about the extent of it. It means we get no custom code running on the server side, right? So SharePoint hosted here is not a direct replacement of what the sandbox was. The sandbox solutions still exist, and you can still write server-side code that will work inside of the sandbox in that limited cut-down framework. SharePoint hosted has 0 server-side code that we can write as part of our app. It all has to be done inside of JavaScript. Auto-hosted, the next option, is a way that we can tell SharePoint to automatically go and talk to Windows Azure websites and to SQL Azure to tell it to provision a website and databases for us automatically when the app gets installed. So this means that as part of our app, we can include the package for the website and databases for Azure. And when somebody installs the app, it will automatically spin them up on their Azure tenant, and then you're ready to go and talk to it as part of that auto-hosted scenario. So that way you've got something that's running remotely but you've still got a very simple installation process. Now, the auto-hosted stuff is not as complete as it sort of sounds. It does sound like a very ideal solution, but there are some big limitations at the moment in that an auto-hosted app currently will not be accepted to be published on the SharePoint App Store. I suspect the biggest reason for this is that there's currently no way inside of Office 365 to do any kind of configuration to say, here's where you need to go and provision this website and this database on Windows Azure. Right, so it is an option for on-premise and having it spin up some of these things for us there, but is not one that I'm seeing widely adopted yet, and I suspect that marketplace reason might be one of the biggest cards there. The last option that we've got here is called provider hosted. Now, this is basically the bring your own hosting option. So when we deploy our app, it can be quite minimal as far as what goes into the app itself. It could just be the manifest saying, yep, here's the URL of my app. And a couple of things to say, yep, this is the page for the web part, this is the home page, and off you go from there. But what we're actually doing is pointing to a URL that can be anywhere on the internet, really, just as long as the clients can get access to it. And we can run it up there. So I could be running up on a Windows Azure website that I've provisioned out myself. I could be running up on a server that's sitting in the middle of nowhere but is still connected to the internet, and got my website sitting on it there. It's completely irrelevant what you're hosted on. So looking at the sort of structure of some of these hosting options, and I've just had a question come in there. So can I give some practical examples of apps? I suppose that's a very open-ended question there for a practical example of an app. It more or less comes down to, I suppose, what are you trying to get customized SharePoint to do? Now, there's some really good examples of what apps can do in the App Store at the moment. Now, if you actually go in and have a look at the SharePoint App Store, there are a number of apps that do all sorts of things. There's things that will create custom lists for you. There's things that will manage your tasks. There's custom workflow engines by guys like Nintex have got a cut-down version of their product which runs completely in Office 365 and lets you use their workflow designer there. There's a lot of things that you can do because the fact is the subset of things you can't do inside of an app is fairly limited. So anything you can think of doing as a SharePoint customization normally can be packaged up as an app if you make it generic enough and deployed out to that wider audience. So coming back to the slide now, we've got, like I said, the three different types of apps here. So the cloud hosted options are your provider hosted and your auto hosted. So in a provider hosted app, we have a dedicated server or hosting service running somewhere. And we essentially look at using the REST and OAuth or client object models to communicate between our app and to SharePoint. Now, this gives the developer or your IT department or whoever's deploying it complete control over the hosting infrastructure of your app. All right, the developer, you're responsible for isolating tenants. Now, this means that if I've got one web server running one instance of my website, for example, but I'm pointing everyone who downloads the app back to that URL, as the developer, I am completely responsible for how my app responds to calls coming from multiple SharePoint sources. So when I run the app on my farm, I expect to get my data out of it, and when somebody else runs it on theirs, they would expect to get their data. How that gets implemented is entirely down to us as developers if we're doing the provider hosted option. It allows us the most flexibility for what we're going to be able to do with our app, but that in turn means that it requires the most amount of responsibility from us to make sure that we get things right. It is really, really open-ended, right? So things that we can do are entirely down to us and how we implement it. We can still, in a provider-hosted app, include things like lists and files and web parts and content types and all that sort of thing. And outside of what's running on our service, we can still include what's called an app web as part of that package. And I'll get to what the app web is on the next slide. Now, the second option, the auto-hosted one I mentioned there, so this is using Windows Azure and SQL Azure and works in much the same way as the provider-hosted one. But the benefit here is that when somebody installs the app, it already knows which tenant on Windows Azure to go to and SQL Azure. So that means the multi-tenancy aspects of our app are automatically provided. As the developer, I don't need to worry about that. I know that when somebody makes a call to that specific Azure URL that is created when the app is installed, they're going to be dealing with just their individual instance of that app rather than the grouped approach that we get with the provider hosted, right? So we get that multi-tenancy, which eliminates a big hurdle of the provider hosted option. And again, we can optionally have an app web in there. Now, the last option, which is living back inside of SharePoint, is our SharePoint hosted one. Now, there's no reason we can't still go and talk to existing sites and services through a SharePoint hosted app. I could be making web service calls through SharePoint out to other data sources and bringing it back in, but it's all happening JavaScript in JavaScript-based code. So it's all HTML JavaScript-based, no server-side anything, so no C# anywhere near a SharePoint hosted app. But it does provide a really simple deployment mechanism in that I don't need to worry about where it's hosted. I'm still just deploying to SharePoint. The big difference is just I'm writing JavaScript instead of C# or managed code. So what is the app web that I'm referring to? Sorry, just a couple of questions that came in on that last slide before I dive into this. If SharePoint 2013 apps are purely created using client-side development, would the traditional skill sets of HTML and JavaScript development be stereotyped in roles like front-end developers? Yeah, possibly. So if I'm looking for a person to work on an app that I'm doing, I am still going to be looking for somebody who's got SharePoint specific skills, right? I want somebody who knows how data is structured inside of SharePoint. I want somebody who knows what APIs and REST endpoints are available. But from the ability of, can you write HTML? Can you write JavaScript? Yeah, sure. I could grab a front-end developer, bring them in, and have somebody else on the team who knows the SharePoint specific stuff and mesh them together like that. But yeah, traditionally those front-end developers have been focused on HTML, JavaScript, client-side technologies, and things like that. So getting that type of person and with that skill set involved in SharePoint development is now much easier because of the fact that it can all be done in that front-end and client-side scope. Okay, so the app web. So we saw in that diagram on the previous slide that an app web is an option for any type of app and is mandatory as part of the SharePoint thing. Now, the best way to look at the app web, it's basically just a regular SP web that works like any other SharePoint subsite. So when we install an app, it can create a subsite, that SP web in the structure for us, that is tied specifically to our app. Now, the thing is that when you browse to this app, it gets forced to be viewed through what's called an app URL. And this dynamically gets generated when we install it. So if you think back and you've run through the week 1 lab where we went through the setup, there was a section in there around how to configure the apps. A lot of that was just follow the instructions, and we'll explain it later. We're going to go through that in the demo and exactly what it all means. But basically, if I browse to a web that is an app, SharePoint will automatically redirect me out to the appropriate URL for that specific web. Now, this means that our webs will always run under a different URL to what the host web has. Now, this is done for a number of reasons, but the primary one is security and isolation. So it means that you essentially put a cross-site barrier in between what's going on in the app and what's going on in the host web. Whereas if I had it running in the same scope as the host web, then there's a whole bunch of things I could do JavaScript-wise to call out to other assets in that site, including other assets inside of other apps, potentially, and be able to run all those on the client side and have it think that it's all part of the same site. Whereas having these unique identifiers for the app URLs ensure that they're going to be completely isolated and are only able to go back to SharePoint through the methods that we're making that are made available, that are essentially designed to stop cross-site scripting and allow that protected access back into SharePoint. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with these app webs as well is I say they are just a regular SP web, but there is a bunch of limitations around what actually happens in that SP web. So there are a lot of things with lists that target client-side functionality that will not work. For example, open in Windows Explorer, connect to Outlook, features like that. Even if you create a list that supports those functions, it won't actually work inside of an app web. All right, so there are a bunch of things to be aware of that may behave differently inside of the app web. But essentially the structure from both a programmatic standpoint and just a genuine stopping to look at it, and we'll go through this in the demo, it for all intents and purposes, is a subweb of the site that you install it in. Okay, so next, integrating remote apps. So one of the problems previously with SharePoint, if you were trying to do something that didn't run on SharePoint, was that you had troubles as far as being able to integrate into different parts of the UI. You had to have something that involved server-side deployment to be able to get to specific parts of SharePoint to be able to customize it. essentially what we've got with the apps is this framework now where we can still do a lot of these hooks into different parts of the UI, but it's now actually going to call out to our remote services and our remote URLs. So there are three types of UX extensions for apps. And when I say UX, I'm talking user experience. So things that the users are going to see and deal with. The first one is what's called the immersive full page app. So the closest example of this in SharePoint 2010 is what you got if you had Office web apps installed. And I clicked on a Word document. And what would happen is I would be taken to what was a full page app where it just had the little SharePoint toolbar across the top, but everything else on that screen was the Office web apps. This is the experience with an immersive full page app where everything that's on the page is customized in our app, and we might just have a tiny little bit of trim or Chrome there that is SharePoint. The second one is the part app. So the client-side web part falls in this category, and we also have another one called the app part, which is a very similar piece of technology there, where we work with the model of users will add parts from our apps to a page, just like web parts, and be able to build up their own little pages with appropriate pieces of functionality based on what they're trying to do. So we can still create these parts. The last one is the UI custom actions. So this is where we get to tie into menus and the ribbon and all sorts of other little places inside of SharePoint, but have it call out to run either some JavaScript that we designate or to call to a specific URL to redirect the user out there. So this means that we can do things that will integrate with the menus and make it look and feel like it was actually part of SharePoint and built in to be there, but is actually still going to execute remotely and not require that server-side code. So that was one of the bigger issues in particular with remote development previously. Question has just come in, are the parts created using iframes? Yes. So when we put a part on the page, it's done using an iframe. SharePoint will pass a number of parameters to us through the URL and the query string to let us know about the context of where things are running. And we can make calls using SharePoint's JavaScript. It's got a bunch of things around the request executor and the web proxy to be able to call back in to get to specific pieces of data that all rely on the permissions that have been assigned to the app. So there's been a lot of thought go into the things, particularly around cross-site scripting, but around how we can keep things isolated and protected, but by still allowing developers to use iframes to run their content anywhere. So if I've got a SharePoint-hosted client web part, the HTML file is just going to be somewhere inside of SharePoint, and it's going to live within my app web. But if I'm running a client-side web part in a provider-hosted model, what's the contents of the iframe might actually be running up in Windows Azure or off on some other dedicated web host elsewhere. All right. Sorry, another question just came in. UI custom actions. How does the menu and ribbon calls run server-side code? They don't. They don't run server-side code. They run client-side code. So if I've got and there's actually a demo of doing a ribbon button in the lab for this. But basically, you call out to either a specific URL that you get redirected to, which might be something running on a provider-hosted model where I can do something server-side there and talk back into SharePoint, but it's not SharePoint server-side. Or I run JavaScript, do it at the client, redirect them to another HTML page, maybe that's using JavaScript API and doing things that way. It doesn't actually run server-side code, though, not on the SharePoint server. Okay, so code limitations for apps and what's going on here. There aren't any real limitations because the APIs are based on those same client-side APIs that were there in SharePoint 2010. They've been extended dramatically to account for a lot more things that used to have to go through server-side code. So things like user profile service, search, things like that. There's now a lot of brilliant client-side APIs that we can use to get to all sorts of functionality there inside of JavaScript, and we don't need to go back to looking at server-side code for this. Given that we're all moving to JavaScript or to remote models where we're going to be dealing with those APIs as a way of getting back in, so the REST-based things, for example, we might need to reevaluate our approaches to coding to account for some of the ways that things are now done, particularly in the frame of mind of looking at things as these are now running asynchronously. Right? So I'm now sending off a request to an API and I'm waiting for a result that might not come back, and I need to account for that. So there's possibly some thinking about the structure of our code and the structure of our solutions that's going to need to change. But realistically speaking, if we're still dealing in the world of everything at the SP site and below, as far as the structure goes, the kinds of things we can do aren't that limited for what we're going to be doing on the client side to what we can do on the server side. And this is the same reason that I said at the start for why we consider apps as a starting point and then fall back to a server-side code when we find a reason to. So authorization of apps. So one of the things that we get with apps is that they need to be given specific permissions to do things inside of SharePoint. So yes, I can install an app, and yes, it can run some JavaScript and talk to content within itself. But generally speaking, if I'm deploying something off into SharePoint, I'm going to look to provide the user some functionality based on data that they have that's stored in their sites and their site collection that's outside of my own web. So there's a bunch of different authorization policies that we can apply that can then kick in to control how data is surfaced up to our app based on a number of parameters. So the three policies that we can get here are the user-only policy, the user and app policy, or the app-only policy. All right, so let me explain these. The user-only policy means that if I am a user and I browse off to an app, and the app goes to call data from a list in the parent site, what's going to happen is, if I flag my app to say go and just rely on the user-only policy, is that as long as that user has permissions to get to the data, then it's going to bring it back. The user and app policy means that you need to authorize the app to be able to get to specific data sources. So the app essentially has its own identity, and the user has to have access to it as well. So for example, I might say an app can have access to this particular part of a site, so a specific subsite. And then when the user makes the request, they will get access to any of the data that they have access to that the app also has access to. So it relies on both having access to be able to get to that specific data. And the last one is the app-only policy. So this is where we can designate that the app can run and it has its own identity, but we don't rely on user credentials. So this becomes handy where there might be a list where you don't give users permission to that list directly, so that they can't go in and do things in that list. But what the app can do is the app can go in and do it. So the users can't directly manipulate the list. They have to go through the app to do it. So it only relies on the app being given permissions. So what actually happens when we install an app, so as part of our manifest, is we say we need permissions to the following resources. So the user gets prompted when they're installing it saying, hey, this app is calling out for access to the user information list and to the site collection and for full control. Are you okay with that? Do you trust this app? So this comes back to a discussion that will quite often happen with 2013 deployments around who gets the ability to install apps and make decisions around which apps are trusted versus which apps are not trusted. Now, for any of the admins out there, there are plenty of policies there around what can be done with saying whitelisting and blacklisting of apps and managing who can do apps, and even a whole licensing framework, which we'll get to later in the slides. But it can have some fairly serious implications, particularly where the code's running remotely and you've said that you trust it. So there is a whole process, and we'll touch on this later as well, around getting apps published up into the SharePoint store and the hoops that you need to jump through there to not only prove your identity in the first place as to you are who you say you are, but then the validation process of the actual apps. Okay, question. Can I give some examples each of three policy type scenarios? Okay, so I sort of touched on that, but we'll try to elaborate. So if I've got a user-only one, I might have permissions applied within my app itself. So my app is a web, and I've got lists there, and I say this group of users has permission to update this particular list. So say I've got an app that's around providing like a news list, for example, like a little news app of some description. I say this group of users from SharePoint has permissions to add items to this list. So then when I create a HTML page that uses the JavaScript API to call to that list, only the users that have got permissions to write to that list will be able to do it. If anyone else calls it that same JavaScript method, it's going to fail because of who it's running as, because that user doesn't have permissions. Now, if you take the user and app policy, exact same scenario. I'm a little news site and I'm publishing items into that list. Except this time the list isn't inside of my app web, it's somewhere else in the site collection. In this scenario, we need to go in and assign permissions to that list for both the user and the app itself. All right, so if I don't assign permissions for the app to that list and I try to call that method, what'll happen is it'll fail saying, yes, the user's got permission, but the app is not authorized to deal with that list. All right, so the app has its own identity where it needs to go there. And the app-only model, exactly the same as the above scenario there, but you work in the theory that your little news list there, users don't have permissions to directly. The only permission that's assigned to that list is for the app. Nobody else has any kind of access to it except site collection administrators and farm admins. And in that scenario, it's completely irrelevant who the user is. That if you make that API call and it comes from that app, then it'll go through. Question, when you have an app on a separate server, how are certificates handled when adding an app to my site and server? Great question. So as far as certificates and stuff go, you've got, so if we're talking about trying to authorize the traffic in between A and B, essentially what we end up with is that, yes, you have to run under HTTPS and have your own client certificate there, but your calls back to SharePoint, they're all basically going through HTTPS as well, right? So you can still secure them using exactly the same mechanisms. If you start talking about running apps remotely in server-side code, then we come back to down to using OAuth as a primary means of communication there. And OAuth has its own encryption that it sits on there based on current timestamps, public key, private keys, all sorts of things like that, that will encrypt the data in the request and then flick it off that way so that it's protected until somebody who's got the private key pulls it back out. So it's not a certificate-based thing essentially there, but it is still protected from anyone who might be watching those calls in and out. So speaking of OAuth, it's a thing inside of SharePoint now, which is great. Hey, so essentially this is one of the primary mechanisms for allowing a remote app to talk into SharePoint. Now, the implementation of OAuth, as far as what we're doing for apps here, though, relies on what's called the Windows Azure Access Control Services, or ACS is what it's referred to for short. So what this means is that you need to connect your farm up to ACS, and set up an appropriate identity provider inside of there, which, if you're talking about something internal, is going to mean referring to like your ADFS and federating Active Directory out, so your internal users can authenticate. But essentially, ACS will be the one that does all the OAuth specific calls around actually authenticating a user and handing back those tokens that can be used. And then the calls to the SharePoint API are made encrypted with the appropriate tokens, but then SharePoint will double check against ACS for, is this a valid session at the moment? So it does add a fairly complex layer to trying to do remote development in this particular scenario. There are a few cases where we get handed the tokens for nothing. One of them is the remote event receiver, where SharePoint will call out to our service and our endpoint and say, here's a token for the user that just triggered that app. So in that scenario, we don't have to go and deal with ACS. But in a lot of scenarios where I'm writing code that isn't triggered by SharePoint, where we're not going to be handed one of those tokens, we are going to have a good look at using OAuth if we're going to go in via those APIs and going to be running externally. So deploying apps for SharePoint 2013, we've got a couple of options depending on where we're going to be deploying to. The first one, as I've mentioned before, is the public App Store. And there is a whole process and checklist, and I actually published the link for it into the portal earlier, of the validation checklist that you need to go through when you submit your app. So what happens is when you submit your app to the public store, after you've gone through all the identity verification stuff to get your account set up, is that someone from Microsoft will sit there with that list and they will go through item by item and attempt to validate your app before it can be approved and published up into the store. The same way as with Windows Phone or with iOS apps for your mobile there, they all go through their verification process. So there is a process, there is a public checklist of the things that they're going to be ticking off. The second deployment option is a private app catalog. All right, so this is for when we're creating apps that are going to be internal to an organization, for example, where I don't want it to go public because it's our own IP. It's not something we want published. It's relevant to our own business, and we're not going to put it out there for the world. So we can actually create an app catalog internally that users can browse and install from in exactly the same way as the public app store. So we upload our app in there, we put image thumbnails and a description on it, and people can then go and download it from there. The other mechanism that exists around deploying apps is what's called sideloading into a developer site for testing. So this is what actually happens if I'm developing remotely. So if I've got Visual Studio installed on my laptop, SharePoint's not installed on the laptop at this point. It's just Visual Studio sitting on top of Windows 8. We can actually talk to a SharePoint developer site as long as I've got HTTP access to it, and deploy my apps, and they'll be what's called sideloaded into that site through a few HTTP calls, and then I can run it from there and debug it in the browser with just JavaScript and do what I'm doing there. So the developer sites don't require any kind of packaging or certification of the apps that are going in there. You can do whatever you want with those. This includes in Office 365. So if you're using Office 365 and you want to debug and deploy and test your way through the examples in tonight's labs, you'll be doing it into a site collection based on the developer site. Question that's just come in is the private app catalog hosted on your own server or on a secured Microsoft app server? It's hosted on your own server. It's literally just another site collection that you can create anywhere inside your web applications, and it lives entirely inside your farm. It doesn't go outside your organization. Is the developer site a replacement for a developer environment? If you're focusing purely on app development and only apps in SharePoint 2013, if you're not even close to interested in doing server-side code in any way, shape, or form, yes, a developer site will let you do everything you need to do for apps, and you won't need your own virtual server to do it. Now, if you are looking at doing any kind of server-side code, though, you're going to need to spin up that VM still. But there are a lot of places that you can go to get that developer environment. So you can, yes, sign up for your Office 365 trial, but you also get one for free inside of an MSDN subscription, for example. Or if you're just legitimately paying for Office 365 and you're a regular customer, it's just another site template. So you can create yourself a developer site whenever you need to, or as many of them as you need within the allowance of what you've got signed up for on your tenant. So yeah, the developer site, if you're only doing the client-side app stuff, yes, can replace that need for a full-on development environment. So updating of apps. So this is an area that got a lot of thought and behaves in much the same way as when we're updating an app on our phone, in that when we deploy an update to an app, so I've deployed app 1.1, 1.2, whatever, and it's going off there, users will get a little notification icon saying, hey, there's an app in this site that's got an update available. Do you want to go and get it? Now, what will happen at that point is it'll recheck all the permissions and then go and make the app unavailable during the app update process. For your auto-hosted stuff, at that point, it'll go and update all the Azure databases, and it'll bring down your web sites within Azure and redeploy them based on the latest packages. Any post-install logic that you build into the app is then executed. The WSP package, which is still wrapped up inside of your app, and we'll touch on that in the lab, is then deployed and your feature upgrades are run, and then the app is turned on and made available again. So it's essentially blocked out to users during that process. But the end user experience is basically that little message saying, hey, there's an update here. Do you still trust this app? Excellent, I'm installing it. I'm now done. Thanks for coming. There's my app. Questions that's just come in is, do you develop apps in the SharePoint App Store? If so, how have I found it? I'll be honest with you, I haven't got around to it yet, and that's purely just been around a lack of time. There are a couple of people that I know that have gone through that, and there's actually a couple of interesting talks that are going to get lined up at TechEd in Australia later this year around doing apps and publishing to the store, and some real life experience from people that have done that. Until the schedules are actually announced for that, I'm not going to go into details there, but there are plenty of people that have put blog posts together as well. I might see if I can try to hunt some of those down, but I personally have not done it. But it's basically the biggest deal is around that audience, right? So if I've created a third-party solution of some description and I'm trying to deploy it, through average means before the 2013 App Store came along, I would rely on my website, my marketing team, my sales team, go out, create interest in that app, bring people to me, and they would have to go and do that work to bring it, right? In this model, the audience is pretty much already there, right? If somebody's in SharePoint and they say, take me to the App Store, great, they're there, my app is listed there, and I have put very little time and money into getting it into that point. I've just worked on, here's the app, and pushed it out. So from that point of view of needing to do a little bit less to make awareness and discovery options around how people can find my app, there's definitely some benefit there. Whether or not this has got the widest audience yet, I don't know. It's ultimately down to how many people are using SharePoint 2013 and how many of them are out actually looking at the apps. And I don't have any numbers or stats around that at this point in time. But for me personally, it is something I am excited about doing. I do have a couple of ideas kicking around the back of my head for apps that I want to write and publish. I just literally have not had the time to be able to get around to doing it at this point. Another question is there any release management in updating apps, i.e. rollback to a previous app version if the update fails? Does the client-side version also roll back? Are there more management options with private app catalogs? Okay, so a couple of questions in there. Are there any additional management options with a private app catalog? No, it's all pretty much the same experience of here's the app, here's this version of the app, and off you go. Is there a rollback if the update fails? I'm not actually sure about that off the top of my head. I will have to go and double check it. Basically, if you're deploying out to the App Store, what will happen is they'll verify that and deploy it out. And I imagine what happens if it fails during that process is it's essentially snapshotting everything as it's going through this update process. So where it pulls the app offline, tries to install it. If that fails, the whole thing fails as a transaction and should roll back. There is a page with a bunch of reading on this that is in the links for tonight's lecture, and I just want to double check what was listed there before you quote me exactly on that. But it should just stay at the current version if the installation fails for some reason. Another extension on that question, so fails if the new version is broken and the previous version is needed. Okay, so in that scenario, so say I deploy version 1.2 of my app to replace 1.1, but 1.2 has actually got some sort of flawed logic in it that just completely does not work. In that scenario, it's up to the developer to go back to the app catalog, retract version 1.2, but then republish version 1.1, but put version 1.3 on it, so it's got a greater version number. All right, so in that scenario, you've then republished it out that way. The users get the message saying, hey, there's an update, and it comes down like that. That behaves in much the same way as like the mobile phone app stores. So I know that if I'm deploying something for Windows Phone, and I deploy an app, and I've actually had this happen to me, is where I've caused exactly that scenario where I've broken some stuff with where I've pushed out, and I get all the emails from the users and nobody's happy. But what actually happens there is that I can go and retract the previous version, which might be 1.3. But that doesn't automatically make 1.2 available again. So I've then got to go out and republish it. And the way to make sure that everybody gets it as an update rather than just new installs is to increment that version number up to 1.4. So then everyone who's got it previously will see, oh, new version, got to go and get it, regardless of what the previous version they had was. And I've restored the functionality based on the code that I had in version 1.1. So that's largely largely managed by the developer. Okay, licensing of apps. So this is something else that comes into play here, and we've got this whole wonderful framework around being able to manage licenses. Basically, there's a few different types of licenses that SharePoint can manage for us, and we get some APIs to call that around. There is the perpetual all-user license, which is basically I've installed it and it's licensed, and I don't care how many users or how often it gets used, just let people use it. The second one is the perpetual multi-user license. So this is, yes, you've installed it, but you have a limited number of people that are allowed to use this. And there's actually mechanisms inside of Central Admin that will let you manage and assign licenses and manage requests for licenses to an app. So that when users go to run your app, you've got the ability to say, are you licensed? If not, get redirected out and put in a request to have a license assigned to you. The third and fourth are just trial versions of that. So we can have APIs there that say, is my app currently running in a trial mode? And if my trial mode has multiple users, is this user licensed for the trial? All right, so we get a whole framework there around that. So the way it all works is we begin with the user goes to the SharePoint store, they buy an app, and then the license token is downloaded into SharePoint. The administrators will go and assign licenses to individual users, and the users can now get to the app. Now, what's worth highlighting here is that if you want to do licensing on an app that is not published to the store, so I want to do licensing on something that is published only to an internal app catalog, the licensing component still needs to be managed by the SharePoint store. All right, so licensing goes through the store. So this might mean that you publish it up, but as a private entry into the store. So it does still exist publicly, and this is the only way that we can manage those licenses, is to have it out there on that store. question is, are app licenses different related to CALs for using enterprise features versus standard features? No, right, so your CALs are your licenses for users to actually get in and use the out-of-the-box features of SharePoint, right? So if I've got all of my users licensed for the enterprise CAL, they can go in and do all the enterprise things. There isn't a framework that I'm aware of for saying here's different types of licenses for an app. It's just you're licensed for the app or you're not. But they don't directly tie back to licensing of anything else that's SharePoint specific. It's just a license to use your app individually. If you wanted to have different editions of your app per se, so like a standard or an enterprise version of your app, you would publish them as two separate apps. So here's my app standard and my app enterprise, and the licensing would apply to each version of the app from there. All right, calling web services in apps. So one of the big things we get with client-side code running inside of iframes is the whole thread around cross-site scripting and how that's all managed. SharePoint actually gives us a web proxy object that we can call out through code, where essentially our JavaScript will make a call to SharePoint, which will then go and make a HTTP call on our behalf, thus avoiding the whole cross-site scripting thing, because it's all technically still going back to the SharePoint site. So sp.requestExecutor is the particular method in JavaScript that can be used to gain access to data inside the host web, because keep in mind it's got a different URL, so it's technically then blocked by the same origin policy. Right, so I can't make a call to get data through the host web directly. I do it through the request executor. All right, branding of apps to integrate into SharePoint's user interface. So I mentioned earlier that we've got this thing called we've got the ability, to make our apps look like the sites that they're hosted in, which is really important from a user experience standpoint, in that our apps look like they belong. We've got this thing called a Chrome control, which can be used to load the styles of the host web, and will essentially give us the out-of-the-box style sheet. Will give us a few controls to make it look and feel like SharePoint. Even if it's just a .html file, it's not running in the scope of an ASPX that uses the master page. We can still make it look and feel exactly like SharePoint, so we don't become dependent on using an ASP.NET master page to create that look and feel. And I've got a really good demo of this coming up that I'm going to hurry along for, or I'm going to run out of time. Remote development. So I sort of touched on this in previous slides. So Visual Studio 2012 can publish apps directly to SharePoint. All right, so we no longer need to have a server locally. The remote websites have to be based on the development site. Right, so if I've got Visual Studio installed on a VM, I've got SharePoint 2013 on the VM, set up exactly the way that the lab guide has for week one that we had to set up your own virtual environment. From there, because I'm local, I can deploy into any kind of site I want. All right, I can deploy into publishing sites, I can deploy into team sites, I can deploy into the developer site. The second I go remote, right, so even if it's just my host machine, in this case, talking to my virtual machine, where it's a second one, it will only let those external ones go into the developer site. And the same is true of Office 365 here. But you'll see, and actually all of the demos that I've got for this week's code, I'm actually publishing them all to Office 365. Right? I'm not doing anything locally here. So this is also another way of showing that, yes, we can do everything here in Office 365 using the apps. And client-side web parts. Like I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I wanted to call them out again because they are an important part of the app framework. If you want to know more about the client-side web parts, go and have a look at what we went over last week. It was in the lecture and the labs around an example of a client-side web part. But basically, the theory of these is that you can integrate in any existing HTML application because everything gets passed as query string parameters. So I might have just a regular HTML page that relies on a few query string things to come through that I could set up as a client-side web part and just put some properties on that web part to specify what those values are going to be in the query string. And I could integrate an application like that very, very easily into SharePoint and make it look like it's a web part, which is a really interesting way of doing things. And the last thing I want to talk about here, and I'm going to briefly show you the code, is remote event receivers. Right? So one of the most common development scenarios for server-side code is to have what's called an event receiver run on a list. So this is the theory of I create an item in a list, and some code of mine will execute in response to that event. Now we've got this theory of a remote event receiver where instead of SharePoint running some code up on the server, it will actually make a call to a web service that I set up saying, hey, this item just changed, this user just changed it, and here's all the properties. So then any of my logic can run in my remote server which might be an iOS-based web service, or it might be something entirely different, just as long as it subscribes to the same contract for the web service there. And it'll pass you through all the tokens you need to emulate the user who triggered that event if you're calling back into SharePoint to update things in response to what they've done. So this way we still get the same functionality of everything we could do in an event receiver previously, but it's now doing all of the server-side code remotely on a remote server that's then going to talk back to SharePoint if and when it needs to. So that sort of wraps us up for the lecture part of this evening. So we talked about the App Store, writing code for apps, how we can deploy and update them, touched on the web services. We talked about the branding and the Chrome control, the remote development options, and we mentioned the client-side web parts at the end there as well. All right, so now let's go and get into a demo. Okay, so what we have here is my development site, when I find where my mouse has gone. There we are. All right, so here's my my site, and what I want to show you guys in Central Admin is some of the app configuration stuff that we went and set up in week 1. So we've got a couple of DNS entries that were set up as well, and I'm going to show you that over here in DNS. So the DNS entries that I got you guys to set up in week 1 were the star entry for csu.local, which basically means anything.csu.local gets pointed back to the SharePoint site. But I also got you to set up an asterisk entry for apps.csu.local. So this is what's going to fall in line for those apps where the URLs are dynamically generated, in that I don't always know the URL that is going to be assigned to an app, but I know it is going to be under apps.csu.local. So this asterisk entry is what's going to make sure that everything DNS-wise is pointing back towards SharePoint. So if I come into SharePoint here, and we go into our apps part of Central Admin, you'll see I've got this option here to configure app URLs. So we have two things here. We have our app domain, so in this case, apps.csu.local, and I have my app prefix, which is called app. And it gives you an example at the top here of the pattern it follows, where it will take our app prefix, app, put a dash in, and then generate a unique identifier for every individual instance of our app. So every time it's installed in a different site, it gets a different URL, dot app domain. So looking at this in real terms, here is the site from last week's demo where I was playing around with, and here's my client web part. The URL that it got generated here, you see, is http app, so there's my prefix, dash my unique identifier, .apps.csu.local. So that's the URL that it actually exists within. And if I go and browse to my web part here, you'll see that, again, up the top here in the address bar, that's exactly where it's taken me. Now, if I try to browse to intranet.csu.local with exactly the same URL, right? So app paste web parts, so this is the URL of my specific web in this case, and intranet.csu.local is that web application. But if I browse to that, you'll see what it's done is it's redirected me straight back to that app URL, right? So SharePoint is aware of the fact that that web is an app and it needs to be isolated and redirected out to the app URL. So there's no way you can browse to that. The other evidence that we get that it's an actual app as well is we can see through PowerShell here, where if I call out to get my site collection, and call out to the all webs property, where is it? There it is. You'll see that it is just an SP web that lives within the site collection. But when it gets returned with its app URL, right? So SharePoint is very much so aware that it is just a web, but it's got that different URL around it to protect it and what's happening there. Okay, so if we go and look at Visual Studio and we want to create apps, Visual Studio 2012. We get a couple of different types of items that we can add, but the project types are very, very simple in that there's just one. So if I say I want a new project, under Visual C#, Office and SharePoint and Apps, I have App for SharePoint 2013. I also have an app for Office, which, there's a whole separate framework for apps for Office, which I'm not going to touch on here because it's another detailed subject on its own. But, we say, let's create a new app for SharePoint. Now, we go through the process here of let's give it a name, let's give it a URL, right? So in this case here, you'll see that it's picked up the last URL that I used, which is my Office 365 site, which gets hosted under SharePoint.com. And it's pointing to a site collection I've created which is based on the developer site. And it even gives us a link here to go and say sign up for a 365 developer site. It asks us here what type of hosting we want to provide. Auto-hosted, provider-hosted, or SharePoint-hosted. So I'll just say SharePoint-hosted for the sake of keeping things simple. But it's going to go off and set up our app for us. So first thing we're doing here is we're just validating against Office 365, right? So it's asking me to sign in. So this way I can't just develop against any random site. It'll go and talk to Office 365, figure out what it needs to know. But you'll see over the side here, I've got my SharePoint structure set up for me here. So there are a bunch of things that are similar to doing things on the server side in that there are still features. So because it's still an SP web, I can still do things with features using exactly the same collaborative, the camel language to add elements into my site. So if I want to provision pages, they still get pushed out through a module. So it's still just a module going to a folder called pages, and default.aspx goes in there. All right. And so all of these, the content that we get by default, like our CSS and our images, they're all going into a feature targeted to the web that will just use standard SharePoint declarative XML to push it all out. So there's a lot of similarities in that regard. There's just a bunch of other things that we can add to the apps which are new. So if I click on here and I say I want to add something into my project, I get all sorts of things. I get the lists, I get remote event receivers, I can still do content types and workflows, site columns, the modules, custom actions for tying into the ribbon. I get the client web part. I can even include an app for an Office thing like Word or PowerPoint inside of my SharePoint app so that it gets deployed out of there, which is actually really cool. Or even a configuration for search. Right, so there is a whole lot of stuff that we can include inside of an app and that gets deployed out. Now, if we go and package my app, so I'm just going to tell it that I want it to build, and go and have a look at what's actually come out. I'll just tell it to deploy to get it to build properly. All right, what you'll see we get here, down the bottom it's just doing some stuff now around installing my app. But under my app here, you see I get a file that is .app file extension. Now, taking to it with 7-zip like we can do with a WSP package to have a look at what's inside of it. Inside of our app, we get a couple of things. We get our manifest XML file. We get icons, a couple of other XML files that describe stuff. But wait a second, we have a WSP package. So that all that feature stuff that was in our app that we did that was still modules and still done the same way, it's actually still packaged up in exactly the same way as server-side code. In fact, I can take this WSP out of the app and deploy it manually if I want, and just miss out on the rest of the stuff that is the app-specific deployment and update mechanisms. So it's done in exactly the same way. So now looking at some specific examples that we've got published in the code for this week. The really basic app demo. Oh, and I didn't tick the box to tell it to remember me, so just let me sign in real quick. I'll tick that little box this time. Okay, so what we get in this case is I've got my ASPX page. Now, the ASPX pages still behave exactly like an ASPX page would within SharePoint in that it still inherits from a master page. So SharePoint will still give me all of that chrome and trim for me. So if we have a look here, I've got my my page tag, and I'm inheriting from web part page. And here's the here's what you need to use for the master page. Right, so the default.master file is what we're calling out. So we still have our content placeholders, and content placeholder main is still where we put all of the the guts of our page essentially. But basically what we've got here is I've just added some code alongside the default one that gets provisioned into my scripts. So if you have a look at app.js, there's a bunch of code here that gets pulled out and run when you create a project, right? So that's all out of the box and just gives you a basic example. But it's got an asynchronous call with the success and fail method. I've got just another function that I've added that says hello using jQuery to go and set a paragraph on the page. So if I press F5 and deploy that, I'm still targeting Office 365 here. So right now what's happening is it's currently uninstalling the previous version that was deployed. It's packaging my code up. It's now installing the app for SharePoint, so it's pushing it up to Office 365 into my developer site. And as soon as it's finished that, it's going to go and open the URL for my developer site. So you'll see here, we log in, and oops, I've deployed the wrong one because I didn't set it there. But you know what, let's actually just browse off to it here. farnhilldev.sharepoint.com. All right, so here's my site, and I've customized the look and feel of it, and I've done a few things. And I've got SharePoint app 1, which was the app that I just pushed out. If I browse on that, you'll see even then it's still generating a unique app URL, so farnhilldev-id.sharepoint.com, and I get hello Brian Farnhill. It's used the call there to be able to say yes, this is who you are, and we've called to SharePoint to get that. Some other types of apps and things we can do with apps is we can do things with lists inside of apps. So if I have a look at my app list demo, you'll see in here I've got a custom task list. So if I open this up, and again we're going to talk to SharePoint, constantly talking to 365 to figure out what's going on, I get, here's a task list that I've created. And it's got all the fields there and all the views and all exactly the same designer as we had when we were doing a list for the server side. But this time it's deploying the list off into my app web. What I've got to run alongside of this is I've got a page where users can go and add items to the list and have it show you all the items that are currently in the list. So I've got some code here, and this is everything I'm showing you here is in the labs and in the lab guide, so you'll be able to go through it in detail there. But basically what I'm doing is I'm just calling out and saying, use the call here to get the JSON data out of SharePoint using the APIs that we've got. And they all run out of that underscore API folder. So I'm calling to my web URL, which I'm setting up here, so it's my relative web URL, to lists, get list by title, then the name of my list, and give me all the items. I want the ID field and I want the title field, and I want you to sort it by ID in a descending order. So it all just goes into the query string. But I'm telling it I want JSON back as the type of data. You can request XML in there as well if that suits you. And we're also putting the request digest on there just to validate that we are a legitimate page inside of SharePoint and what the current security context of the user is. But we push that off and we get our data back, and we go and format it out into a table. And I've also got another one which uses the APIs to basically create a new item. All right, so in this case, I'm creating a post request using JSON to stringify up some object properties. So the type is going to be that type of list item, and I'm setting a title on it, just a really basic thing, just add an item with a title, and push that out. So inside of SharePoint, my app list demo looks a little bit like that. So it's pulled a bunch of items out of my custom task list, and I can say Brian was here and have it add to my list. Now the proof that this is actually a custom list lies in that I can browse to the URL there. So if I just take it out to my web URL and I go to /lists/custom task list, here is my list. using exactly the same pages that SharePoint normally gives you to manage a list. Right? I don't get list settings in full like I would normally get with a list, but it is, for all intents and purposes, a SharePoint list that we can do things with and manipulate, and I can add items to it here directly if that was what I wanted to do. Question that's come in is, could I explain what the process is needed to create an MVC app with SharePoint, since it does not give you this option inside of Visual Studio? Okay, so if you want to create an MVC app inside of SharePoint, this is what you do with it as a provider-hosted app. So inside of Visual Studio, I would say create a new app that is provider-hosted, and it would ask me, what is the URL of my provider-hosted app? And I'll give it whatever the appropriate URL is. I would then just create a regular MVC website and deploy it up to wherever it needed to go to for the URL that I've told SharePoint about. So in that case, the app package that we deploy to SharePoint is nothing more than a manifest with the XML file in it that says, here's where this thing is running. All right, so in that case, I can then go and do my stuff with the MVC app, but have it surface up inside of SharePoint and look like it's a SharePoint app. But yeah, so that's where you'd use provider hosting. Okay, the next demo that I've got here is around one that reads from the membership list to get a list of users who are in the site. So what I'm doing in this case is I've actually got to tell SharePoint that I need some extra permissions. So the list of people who have got access to a site resides in the root of the site collection, which is out of the scope of where my app can get to by default. By default, unless an app asks for it, it will only get permission to things it deploys. So if I click on the app manifest.xml as part of one of my solutions, you'll see rather than opening an XML file, it actually gives me a designer here for editing all of the details to do with my app. I get its title and name. I can update the version number, set the icon, what's the start page, what tokens go into the query string. So if I need to include additional things beyond the standard SharePoint tokens, I can add them here. What type of hosting is this? But here's the interesting one, the permissions tab. So I can request any number of permissions when the user installs this app. I might need access to the BCS. I might need access to the newsfeed to pull data about users. I might need to use search or taxonomy. I can put in all of these requests, and when the user goes to install the app, they'll be told, hey, this app is going to do the following, and you're trusting it to do so. So in this case, I'm saying I need the read permission from the site collection. That's going to let me get to the user info list. There's a bunch of other things in here as well around prerequisites, so auto-hosting prereqs for a website or a SQL database. Supported locales, so I can do different regions and different languages within my solutions with the resource files. And I can also designate a number of remote endpoints in the app. So these are remote endpoints that SharePoint will trust, so that when we make calls through the SharePoint proxy objects to remote sources, it has to be on this list of allowed endpoints. So it'll validate it from here. So going back to what we're actually doing in this one with our JavaScript, you'll see that what I'm doing is I'm getting access to the current web's URL. And I'm calling out to a list called the user information list. Oops, sorry, back over here. So using that same API path that I was using in the previous one, but API/site/root web. All right, so this is where we're calling to the thing and saying, I'm going to the root web of where I'm deployed. All right, and from there, go to lists and get a list called the user information list. So this is actually stored in every single SharePoint site collection by default, and it tracks users that have been into the site. But it's essentially just a list, so I'm accessing it in exactly the same way. I'm getting all of my data, I'm getting it back as JSON, and then I'm passing it out into a table. So what I'm going to do now, though, is I'm actually going to deploy this to get this one to reinstall. So set it as startup project and F5. So you'll see what actually happens when I try to install it because of the fact that I'm requesting an additional permission. So you can see down the bottom here, Visual Studio gives me a bit of a progress update as to exactly what I'm doing. And while I'm waiting for that, there was another question regarding the app manifest permission configuration. When would you use the prerequisite of a SQL server? Sorry, so that's a prerequisite of a SQL Azure database. So if I'm doing an auto-hosted app, it says make sure that this database exists on the Azure tenant before it can continue. Outside of that scope, that permission is useless. Okay, so back to what we're doing here. So instead of debugging and going straight into my app, what I'm getting is a do you trust this list? All right, so also do you trust membership list, because that's the name of my app. And here's its icon. And basically it says we're letting it read items in the site collection and let it access basic information about the users of this site. All right, so every app gets that by default, in the fact that if a user browses to my app, I get some basic information about them. But this one is saying, go and read from lists in the site collection. So this is a specific permission that's outside the scope of my app. So if I say trust it, SharePoint will let me go and install it, and now it'll take me off to my app, where it's going to pull out a list of one lonely user saying, hey, there's Brian. But we've also got the other out-of-the-box groups and some of the Office 365 accounts in this one, basically saying these are all the users that I know about. But you can see it's made that call to the root site collection outside of the scope of my app. So we'll close that, we'll come back. Have a look now at the custom ribbon demo. So what we've got here is an example of being able to customize the ribbon. Now, looking at the app manifest here, I'm not requesting any special permissions in this case, right? I'm just saying, here's my app. But I've got this element that I've created called my custom button. So we use the custom action element, which is still just part of that same feature XML, to define that we're creating a new button for the ribbon. Now there's a whole bunch of custom XML around this and how you do it, and we touched on in previous weeks that there are designers out there for this if you want to go and buy a product, or you can copy and paste the out-of-the-box stuff, or it actually generates a lot of this for you by default. When you go through and you create it, it gives you a little wizard saying what type of button, what type of library do you want it to show up in, and that sort of thing. So what I'm doing in this case is I'm saying I would like to register this button for lists of a particular type. 101 is a document library. And I'm creating my definition here for a button. It's going to have this text and this image. And when you click on it, it's going to take you to this URL. So what we're actually getting here is pointing back to the URL of my app and saying that, app pages default.aspx with my standard tokens, but also the GUID of the list that you came from. So in this scenario, if I had the site collection permission, I could actually go back and get additional data about that list if I wanted to. In this case, I've just shown that it works in the query string and that you don't need the permission for the ribbon button specifically. But when that app is installed, if we go back in here to my custom ribbon, you see that it's just the stock standard page when it loads. Right, hello, Brian Farnhill. But if I go back to a document library in my site, right, so show me the site contents and show me my documents. Up in the ribbon here, based on the information, I've got a custom button here, CSU dev. And when you click on it, it takes you through, and you'll see at the end of the query string that I have SP list ID equals and the ID of the list that we just came from. So this way we can create a custom page that the user might be redirected to, and we'll do some sort of client-side code to react to that button press, and then we might just redirect them back out to where they came from. It all depends on exactly what we're trying to customize it to do. Another question, a couple of them that have come in there. Is the code used in this webinar available for download? Yes, as with all of the lectures to this point, they're all in that learn.itmasters.edu.au site. And they're also sitting on a GitHub repository that's public there, and the link is in the portal there as well. But every bit of code is downloadable, and the lab guides talk you through creating all of this code. Right, so if you've got the Word document there, you'll be able to go through step by step and create it. Question around the app manifest XML permission trusting. When a user is asked to trust the app requesting the permission, does the user themselves need to have the required access before the app can gain access to it, or is that an app authorizing licensing thing? Now, you can give a user permission to install an app, and that's a specific thing to say these are the users that can install apps. They then get the ability to install an app inside of the site collection. I am 99% sure that the user cannot grant an app permissions that the user does not have. So if an app starts requesting permissions to something, then the user that installed it needs to have those permissions as well. Otherwise, there'd be a bit of a security loophole there. There is some stuff around the app permissions and the app being assigned specific permissions to content where that may not apply. But then there's also an additional warning there saying the app will have permissions to do things as well, and they get that on that trust screen too. But again, there's a bunch of stuff that administrators can control around that too, and there's some detailed documentation around those permission requests in the MSDN links that have been posted for tonight's webinar. All right, second last demo, and we've got 5 minutes left, so let's hurry this along, is the Chrome control. So one of the things you may have noticed back in my site here is that we've got a site that looks different. And if I go into this particular app here, my Chrome demo app, you'll see it looks like SharePoint. Now, I don't know if you caught it in the streaming there, but what actually loaded first was a very blank looking page, just white with black text, and then it kicked in and looked like SharePoint. This is because what we're looking at here is just a standard HTML page, right? And if I come up here, you'll see that it's in my thing behind all of these query string parameters, home.html. So I'm no longer in the context of an ASPX page that runs inside of a master page. I am just a static HTML file. Now, the code for this and how it works looks a little bit something like this. Chrome demo app, pages, home. So basically, very, very simple cut down HTML5. Here's my head tag, here's my body tag. I'm referencing my app CSS, which is my own custom stuff, my own custom JavaScript, and my jQuery. Let's go and have a look what I'm doing in my own custom JavaScript, because this is where the magic happens. So here I'm making a reference to sp.ui.controls.js. This is one of the out-of-the-box JavaScript files that, just for the sake of completion, I've directly consumed inside of this particular project. But you can just refer to it directly through its URL in the layouts directory. What I'm doing here is I'm actually creating a new object called sp.ui.controls.navigation. Right, so this is what's commonly referred to as the Chrome control. I'm passing a bunch of options into it, just through an array of JavaScript strings here, around what is the icon of my app, what is the name, what's the URL of my help page, are there other settings, links that I want to show to users, and what are their texts and what are their URLs and that sort of thing. But basically, I just create all that up, all right, and then go and say set nav visible true. All right, so very, very basic code. The thing here is that I'm passing it the ID of a specific container, Chrome control container, which if you have a look back here, is just an empty div tag that is my placeholder at the top here. So what my JavaScript is doing is it's pumping all of that out inside of that div tag. So if we come back here, pull up my IE developer tools and have a look what's going on up here, there's my container, and there's all of the stuff inside of it that SharePoint's going to generate it for me from that JavaScript. You'll even see over the side here, I get a little settings menu with my custom links that I've created that were in that JavaScript as well. Right? So it's all in there, ready to access and ready to use. Question that's come in there is, would I briefly address the exam? Format, number of questions, time limit, etc. Did I write the exam, and is it exclusively around what has been delivered in the course? There'll be more information about the exam that gets published in the next couple of days. It is happening next Thursday night. Basically, it's a 1 hour exam, I believe it is, and there's going to be a number of questions, but all of the questions in the exam are going to be focusing on only what has been taught in this short course. All right, so what's been happening over the last 4 weeks, the links to readings that I've been giving that have been posted, the source code that we've been publishing, the lab guides, that sort of stuff. So as long as you've got all that covered off and you've been doing the readings and that, you should be ready for the exam. But it's not going to focus on anything that hasn't been specifically addressed through one of these webinars. Okay, so moving along, there's a couple of other things we can do with the Chrome control to implement it a little bit differently rather than doing it directly through JavaScript. So I've got another page here and it all looks exactly the same, but it's actually rendered out differently as far as the HTML for it goes. So if I come up here and open contact.html, you'll see that I'm not actually referencing anything more than the JavaScript for sp.ui.controls. None of my out-of-the-box ones, so my out-of-the-box one that does its magic is not there. But in my Chrome container, I'm actually using a couple of different attributes. The first one here, data.ms.control, SPUI controls navigation. So this is a way of flagging to some JavaScript that's being run out of this SPUI controls.js that this div tag is to be treated as if it is one of those controls. And then data.ms options is exactly the same options array that I created in code beforehand. So this way I'm not doing it in JavaScript and then saying go and apply it. I'm letting it be implied inherently by the fact that it's on the page, and then SharePoint's own JavaScript will go looking for it as the page gets loaded. So this way, it's all inline in the page. This sort of thing is helpful if you've got one page that needs to look different to the others, or you've got different settings for one page. Generally speaking, the do it in your one JavaScript file and refer to that one JavaScript file across multiple pages is going to be the preferred way of doing things, though. But you've got that as a second option for a way to do this. Now, I'm right on the buzzer, but one of the things I wanted to show you guys really quickly is what the code for a remote event receiver looks like and how that gets provisioned up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and open up that SharePoint app 1 that I just created earlier. And it apparently forgot that I ticked assign me inbox. Okay, so what we get over here once Visual Studio has finished loading for me is, come on, come back. Is I want to create a new item, and I want it to be in a remote event receiver. All right, so it's going to ask me a few things as we go through this wizard here, saying what type of events do I want to listen to? What should the source be? So I might say I want to hear about every item being added into a document library. This is the same as the server-side setup for an event receiver. But the difference here is that when I click Finish, you'll see that what's happened is I've now got SharePoint App 1 and SharePoint App 1 Web. It's gone and created an iOS website for me that is got a web service inside of it. All right, so if I have a look down here, I've got a web config file. I've got my default.aspx page, which is empty at this particular point in time, bunch of JavaScript, but here my remote event receiver 1 service. So what has actually happened by doing this? If I go back into my app manifest up here, oops, you'll see it switched it from SharePoint hosted to auto hosted, saying, well, yes, you've got to be one of the cloud hosted options for this to work. Basically, what we get here is we inherit from a couple of things in the Microsoft.SharePoint.client namespace, right? So this is a redistributable DLL that we can include in client applications, be it ASP.NET websites or .NET, desktop style apps, or anything really. And it uses this interface to say, here's what a remote event receiver should look like. And basically, we receive a call out to this method called process event, which includes a whole bunch of properties. These are the properties that tell us what the item was, who edited it, all the usual properties we get when doing a server-side thing. It also gives us a reference to this thing called a token helper. Now, token helper is actually specific to our class, and to our library, and it actually gives us this by default. And if you go and start expanding all of the code in here, there is actually a ridiculous amount of code that it uses for essentially translating the key that it passes down to you into a new key that you can use when making a call back into SharePoint, so you don't need to worry about that. It's using all the signing and encryption stuff that goes along with OAuth, and if you rip it apart, that's essentially what it's doing. But basically then we get our client context object and we work with it exactly the same as the managed.NET client code, in that we can make requests back into SharePoint. They're all asynchronous. We wait for responses and then we can pass it back into SharePoint. So the thing here is that these events are all going to run asynchronously. They're not going to be tied to the user waiting for something. And but it gives us the same ability to run complicated event receivers, but run them outside of SharePoint and as part of an app. So we can include that in the app and do some complicated thinking there. So that's about the end of the demos that I wanted to show you guys through. Like I said, that's all detailed in the lab guide. All the source code is there. So please go and have a look at it. The readings tonight, there are a lot of references to some of the app pages on MSDN. Do read through them, and again, as usual, just click a couple levels through the links to find the related content to a lot of those pages. Can we have some sample questions for the exam question that just came through? Maybe leave that one with me. If they're going to get posted, we'll put them up onto the discussion forum during the week. But keep an eye on that for all information to do with the exam next week. But yeah, so thank you guys for coming to the last of the webinars. I hope you guys have been getting something out of this this series. I've been enjoying being able to lecture it and give it for you. Again, if you've got questions, comments, need help with anything at all, please get on that discussion forum, flick the questions in, and I'll get back and answer them as quickly as I can. But otherwise, have fun playing around with the apps, guys, and you'll hear more about the exam next week as we go through. Thank you for watching.